Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in Junior English. We now turn in your hymnals to page 1349 and following, the Yusef Komunyakaa poem, Camouflaging the Chimera. Let's introduce ourselves to this poet who was born in 1947, as we're told. Yusef Komunyakaa was born in Louisiana. In 1965, he joined the Army and was sent to Vietnam. He served there as an information specialist, reporting from the front lines and editing a military newspaper called the Southern Cross. Again, one more time, one more writer who ends up in coming out of journalism. He earned a Bronze Star while he was there. After the war, Komunyakaa pursued his education, earning a BA at the University of Colorado, an MA at Colorado State University, and an MFA at the University of California, Irvine. In 1977, he published his first collection of poetry and has been publishing his poems ever since. The next heading, Poet of the Vietnam War. Komunyakaa achieved his true breakthrough moment in literature with the 1988 publication of Dinh Cao Du, the Vietnamese for This Crazy Head, in which he took on the subject of his experiences in Vietnam. It took me, quote, "It took me 14 years to write poems about Vietnam," end quote, Yusef Komunyakaa said in 1994, shortly after winning the Pulitzer Prize for Neon Vernacular, another poetry collection. Quote, he says, "I had never thought about writing about it, and in a way, I had been systematically writing about it," end quote. About Komunyakaa's work, the poet Tori DeCourty has written, quote, "He takes on the most complex moral issues. His voice, whether it embodies the specific experiences of a black man, a soldier in Vietnam, or a child in Louisiana, is universal. It shows us in ever deeper ways what it is to be human," end quote. Final heading, Beyond the Vietnam War. American involvement in the Vietnam War lasted from 1961 to 1973. The war presented American military forces with the frustrating and terrifying problem of how to fight in dense jungle against the Viet Cong, or VC, an enemy capable of magically merging with the landscape. As Camouflaging the Chimera demonstrates, part of the answer to this problem involved sending small groups of American soldiers into the jungle to wait in ambush for the elusive enemy. And of course, we're going to immediately remember here earlier some titles that specifically treated issues of the Vietnam experience. Let's now turn to Camouflaging the Chimera, and we'll just read the poem. Now, one of our focus here is to ask, what exactly is the voice in this? Now, this is going to be an interesting first person, it's very suspenseful, first person kind of text. Let's take a look now at Camouflaging the Chimera.
Camouflaging the Chimera by Yusef Komunyakaa. We tied branches to our helmets. We painted our faces and rifles with mud from a riverbank. Blades of grass hung from the pockets of our tiger suits. We wove ourselves into the terrain, content to be a hummingbird's target. We hugged bamboo and leaned against a breeze off the river, slow dragging with ghosts from Saigon to Bangkok, with women left in doorways reaching in from America. We aimed at dark-hearted songbirds. In our way station of shadows, rock apes tried to blow our cover, throwing stones at the sunset. Chameleons crawled our spines, changing from day to night, green to gold, gold to black. But we waited, till the moon touched metal, till something almost broke inside us. VC struggled with the hillside, like black silk wrestling iron through grass. We weren't there. The river ran through our bones. Small animals took refuge against our bodies. We held our breath, ready to spring the L-shaped ambush as a world revolved under each man's eyelid.
All right, let's take a look now at the poem as a work that tries to somehow put you right in the experience, Camouflaging the Chimera. We'll work now, first of all, at 2B. Just notice, for example, the way that the poem is constructed with stanzas. And notice that these stanzas then are constructed with certain kinds of action happening in almost every stanza. So as we look in each stanza, we'll ask, what exactly is it that they're doing? Now, let's begin with title. Camouflaging, of course, means to hide. The chimera here, of course, has something to do with a mythic monster. We might say the horrors of war. You can read at the very bottom at 1350 that Greek mythology, this fire-breathing monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail, the chimera. The chimera here is going to be representative of what? Well, we may ask some questions about specifically what it is that they are trying to hide. We might say the fierceness, the violence of it all as we go forward. Let's begin, notice, by the we. So you're going to have a speaker in this poem. Write this down. You're going to have a speaker in this poem who is speaking for all of the soldiers who were a part of this experience of being in Vietnam. Right? And we'll of course hearken back to earlier titles that we were working with in our text together when we read it, of course, the Tim O'Brien classic, Ambush. And we're playing the exact same game. We would want to write that down right now at 3A, right? That Ambush story, where we're playing a very similar kind of game of what it's like to go through an experience of being in war itself. I have taught this poem to a number of young men and women who have gone on to join the U.S. military and have reported back the feelings of this poem are so powerfully captured as they're lying in wait. Notice, we tied branches to our helmets. We painted our faces and rifles with mud from a riverbank. Blades of grass hung from the pockets of our tiger suits. We wove ourselves into the terrain, content to be a hummingbird's target. Let's pause for a moment. Jot down, what's the image at level 1? You maybe will jump quickly to level 3A. What is your films that paint this powerful image of men dressed up and hidden in camouflage in wartime? What is it for you? Some will report video games more quickly come to mind that show the ways in which humans tried to become part of the terrain. They wove themselves into the terrain, content to be a hummingbird's target. They are so much a part of the terrain and so still that a hummingbird will come up and believe them part of the terrain, part of the landscape. The next one, we hugged bamboo and leaned against a breeze off the river, slow dragging with ghosts. Now, slow dragging here is an interesting phrase. It can have something to do, of course, with smoking a cigarette and dragging the cigarette slowly. The ghosts from Saigon to Bangkok will be, of course, any number of memories that these men are working with as they are there. Of course, they are also going to remember the women left in doorways. Here we're thinking, of course, of maybe women that these men will have experienced for just one night. Reaching in from America, this may all obviously be as well the women that they left back home, lovers, sisters, mothers, who are maybe hugging them as they leave for the last time. We're still working at level 1. Notice we aimed at dark-hearted songbirds. In other words, kind of finding in their scopes birds, anything else that's moving. In our way station of shadows, rock apes tried to blow our cover, throwing stones at the sunset, the ways in which shadows shift, and you're no longer camouflaged anymore. Chameleons crawled our spines. The interesting use of the word chameleon, of course, is that it can be quite literally that when you lay still and you are in ambush, you are not allowed to begin to move if bugs or insects start crawling all over you. You have to continue to lay still, and this can be sometimes very difficult. Changing from day to night, green to gold, gold to black. But we waited till the moon touched metal, till something almost broke inside of us. The lying, the waiting, They're waiting. This is the experience of the Vietnam experience, which comes back to us through the Tim O'Brien story, as well as, of course, through this poem here, and any number of other writers of that experience who report that they were taken up out of their experience of living in America and dropped down into Vietnam and the jungles and the jungle terrain, and there they had to learn how to become part of the terrain to save their lives, and of course, to experience the fighting of the Viet Cong. Then all of a sudden, the poem shifts, and we're no longer focusing on those in camouflage, but now we're focusing specifically on the enemy. Something almost broke inside of us. VC, the Viet Cong, struggled with the hillside, so you can see them coming. Like, another interesting simile, black silk wrestling iron through grass. We weren't there takes us back to the title of camouflage. The river ran through our bones. Of course, here the obvious question is, what river? Not just a physical river, but we might say an emotional or a spiritual river. Small animals took refuge against our bodies. So maybe even they're laying there so still that an animal could come up and nestle next to them, right, for protection. We held our breath, ready to spring the L-shaped ambush. And then another simile, as a world revolved under each man's eyelid. The final moments, maybe, right before the ambush is to take place. Okay, so that's level 1. Let's now jump to level 2 and 3. We'll begin at level 2A. Major messages and themes of this poem. What do you want to jot down is the primary message here? Is it about hiding? Is it about violence and the ambush that soon is about to take place? Is this poem really not about fighting, but about the effects long after felt by those who experienced this and continue to experience this? Of course, this is again a potential poem, a social commentary. The ways in which we as normal Americans maybe don't think very seriously about the sacrifices of those who are fighting in the theater of war, men and women. Let's list several possible messages here. One, obviously, is war affects the young in profound ways. Let's write that down. If you have to go through the camouflaging experience and camouflaging the chimera in war, you have to do it after you return from the war as well, regularly. We are familiar, of course, with the challenges to those fighting men and women who have gone through horrific experiences in wartime, who then have to come back, and they sometimes have to continue to camouflage the chimera. At 3A, for a text maybe that you're somewhat unfamiliar with from an earlier time, there's a famous band called Pink Floyd who wrote an album called The Final Cut that you might want to take a look at. The idea that when men and women come back from the war and fighting, they have to find a way to fit back into society, and it's not always easy to do that. Of course, another major message here is that when one becomes part of a fighting experience, one has to not be there to be there. We weren't there. In other words, you cannot think about too much what it is that you're doing at the time. You have to just be able to respond. At 2B, notice the power of this poem. It puts you right there with the individual who is speaking for the group. We held our breath. Sometimes if you're reading this poem closely, you almost have a tendency to hold your breath yourself. Or maybe, for example, you can be right there as they're sitting next to the river, hearing the river flow by, thinking about all the people back home. At level 3, and the ways we relate to this, let's jot down a couple right now. What is for you your classic text of war? Is it a video game? Is it a movie? Is it a TV show? When we were reading this, what was the text that immediately came to your mind's eye? Was it from maybe Oliver Stone's classic films that portrayed so much of the Vietnam era? Platoon comes to mind. Born on the 4th of July Comes to mind any number of the other classic movies that have been made that try to present what the experience was like of wartime. Of course, it always begs the question, why do you think it is the case that so many of us love to play the video games that have something to do with fighting and with war, that put us in that experience? Many, of course, who have experienced fighting in wartime will often report there's too much missing in these video games that get played, especially many have said the smells. The smells are just not there to make it like what it really is. Of course, at 3B, in our ability to relate to this, let's ask a couple of important questions. One, why do you think it is the case that we so regularly do not fully respect the work of the fighters and the men and women in the armed forces? Why do you think that's the case? Why do we often overlook them? The work that they do to gain freedoms and protection for the rest of us, and the need to respect the work that they do, even if we don't necessarily always agree with what is expected of the fighting soldiers, men and women of our armed forces, the military. For example, you can be a pacifist and against war and still respect those who have to be in situations where they are defending their nation. Of course, the other question has to do with you personally. What is your thought about fighting? What is your thought about personally being involved in protecting your nation? If, for example, the draft were to ever be resurrected and you were asked to go and serve to defend your country and to die, is that something you would report you're willing to do? Or would you have serious problems with that? And why would you have serious problems with that? Of course, we can ask about this photograph that you see there on 1350, 1351. A lot of students will report it's the eyes in that picture that I find compelling, and I want to comment on that. That's another 3A observation, right? Finally, this poem can be read as metaphor. In what ways do we, as Prufrock will say at T.S. Eliot's Love Song of Jalfred Prufrock, prepare a face to meet the faces that we meet? In what ways do we camouflage or hide the chimera or the monster, the negative energy that is inside of us? In what ways do we not let people always know exactly who we are? Do you have an experience that you can write about at a time that you kind of hid who and what you were, that you camouflaged the chimera? Well, there you go, another challenging poem for us to maybe think about, and the sacrifices of those men and women of the armed forces. Thank you.